Hi, I'm Rob Harrison-Plastow from Source 9 Insights, and in this video I'm going to take you through a model for behaviour change. So this has been born out of a lot of work over a long period of time, taking in lots of different sources. There's been all sorts of different attempts at behaviour change. It's a topic that gets used a lot in a lot of different contexts. I talk about it quite a lot in terms of sustainable behaviour change, working with brands, businesses, looking to better understand people's adoptions of certain types of behaviour in relation to consumption. Also working with not-for-profits who are trying to understand and shift behaviours based on the research that they're doing and the goals that they've got as an organisation. Likewise with policymakers, trying to do similar things. And then also in education, which is where I first came upon it when I was working in higher education, understanding how do people change, how do people transform, because if you look around the world, you can quite clearly see that information doesn't change behaviour, so what does? In particular, if you look at the work of marketers, so we work with lots of strategists, planning directors and so on, ad agencies and CMOs at large brands, trying to work out why do people do what they do, and then how can they show up in such a way that they can connect with them and encourage some behaviours more than others. One thing I'll say that comes up at the end of this is that you can't make anybody change, you can't make anybody transform, but the nature of the model that I'm going to share with you now is all about how do we work with what's already out there, how do we find ways of connecting with people, understanding people. How can we see through the eyes of another in order to then understand where their behaviour is coming from, and how we as a brand, as a not-for-profit, as a policymaker or anything like that might want to show up in ways that help people to see things differently, to challenge some existing behaviours and to encourage the adoption of different ones. So let's get into it then. So first thing, we call this an ontology. Basically, this is about how do people make sense of the world. So it's all about how are we being in the world? How do we interpret reality, I guess? And then from that, everything else follows. So the type of work that we do, what we're trying to understand and so on. So we're looking at how people make sense of the world and how meaning is created. A quick note for people that love a bit of academic sourcing and referencing. I'm not doing any referencing in this video whatsoever because it's a 20-minute YouTube video. But if you did want to go down the rabbit hole of it, get in touch with me. I can share sources with you. But essentially this is all about social constructionism, social constructivism, narrative economics, non-violent communication, transformative learning theory, and critical pedagogy. So with that aside, let's keep going. Ultimately, if we're looking at behaviour change, what we really need to understand is what drives behaviour. So I quite often ask this question in workshops and talks, and people often come up with all sorts of different explanations as to what is driving our behaviour. And what I annoyingly do is then, whatever the answer is, I just keep asking why. And it may be, for example, that somebody is adopting a certain behaviour to achieve a certain aim, and we think that that is a thing. So, for example, somebody might want to have social status, or they might want to make a load of money, or they might want to do all these different things. But the thing is never the thing. Behind that, there's always an ultimate outcome that is seeking to be achieved. Whatever it is, just question that behaviour. Why is somebody doing that? What is it they're seeking to achieve at the end? And whatever that thing is, go beyond it and find the feeling. Everybody is doing something in order to feel a certain way. The feeling is the ultimate end goal. So why do people do what they do? It all comes back down to emotion. I think this quite often gets left out of models of behaviour change, and it's absolutely integral to marketing, yet it's very difficult for people to clearly articulate and pin down in a reliable and repeatable way what it is about emotion and how to work with it that's at the root of all these things. And that's what I'm going to take you through in this video. So it begs the question, what are emotions? Ask yourself this question. I'll give you a starter, it's this idea that emotions are ways of naming subjectively experienced feelings. And what I'd love to get across very clearly is that emotions are responses. Okay, so they're subjectively experienced feelings and they are responses. We'll build on this a little bit more in a moment. What do emotions do? Well, they, in one respect, are physiological responses. So this could be something like they create and trigger sweating, increased heart rate, butterflies in the stomach, the things that our autonomic nervous system does, where there's no conscious effort required at all. And then, more interestingly for what we're talking about, they create behavioural and expressive responses. So these are the things that are observable to other people. So facial expressions, body language and actions, anything from crying and shouting to singing and punching in the air in celebration. So there's this direct role between an emotional response and then some kind of physiological or behavioural and expressive response as well. So it's like this little causal chain. So why do we have emotions? They play a key and crucial role in human experience. They influence our perception, our decision making, our interaction with others. You can think about them in terms of like a product of evolution. They help us in terms of aiding our survival by helping us to respond to environmental stimuli with appropriate action. So they are this guidance system that has this huge impact on behaviour. As we said at the top, it's like all behaviour essentially is trying to reach some kind of outcome that has this emotional experience that's the end goal that's being sought. They are absolutely essential to the human experience. And in different cultures, they play different gradations of importance, integrated and incorporated in cultures in different ways, in different times, in different places. But what I really want to get across is that they are responses. They keep us alive. They're related to behaviour. They're related to perception, to interaction, and to decision making, which is why they are absolutely essential to be a part of any kind of behavioural change model. So how do emotions work? Okay, so all models are wrong. Some are useful. I'm going to share with you now a model that I particularly enjoy using. It's created by someone called Marshall Rosenberg, who in turn took it from, developed the work of Manfred Max Neef, who was an economist looking to understand what are the universal needs that are behind the human experience. He was looking to create an economy that wasn't based on GDP growth, but instead was based on human flourishing and thriving. So it made sense to him to try and pin what is human flourishing and thriving. What is that? Pin it down. What are the different elements? And he came up with 9 universal needs that are essential to the human experience. And then that's why we're called Source 9, by the way. And then Marshall Rosenberg then went and took the 9 universal needs, saw some relationships between them, and condensed them into 7 emotional needs. So emotions and emotional responses can be categorized into 7 different categories, 7 different emotional needs. And when we perceive these needs being met, we experience positive emotion. And when we perceive our needs not being met, we experience negative emotion. So this is a model for understanding how emotion works. 7 emotional needs and an ongoing unconscious perception of whether or not those needs are actually being met. If they're being met, feel good. If they're not being met, we don't feel so good. And that is this pivotal logic to emotion. So let's look at them. What are they? The 7 emotional needs are connection, physical well-being, peace, meaning and purpose, play, honesty, and autonomy. So for connection, what does this mean? Well, this is all those webs of relationship that we're entangled in. It's things about acceptance, belonging, cooperation, empathy, inclusion, intimacy. It also reaches into ideas of being understood and understanding others, feeling heard, feeling that sense of trust and warmth. It's all about the strength and quality of relationships. Next up, honesty. This is all about truthfulness, trustworthiness, authenticity. We can smell it a mile off if someone's being inauthentic, if someone's being dishonest, and there's this deep emotional need for this honesty. We really value this. And it's also linked to confidence, honour, frankness, things like that. It's about integrity, authenticity. Physical well-being. This one's a little bit more obvious. So this is like nourishment, air, food, movement, rest, water, all these sort of things that keep us alive, sort of things that you might have come across in Maslow's hierarchy of needs and things like that. And then there's play. This idea that it's fun, there's recreation, there's humour. We have this as a deep human need. Life without play wouldn't be as joyful and as fun and as enjoyable as it is. So there's this deep need for that too. Another need that comes up often is autonomy. So I think of this in terms of freedom, choice, agency, self-determination. This is a key human driver. Next up, we've got peace, and this doesn't just mean a sense of calm. It's also the sense of peace in terms of satisfaction, contentment, harmony, unity, beauty. So we get into all kinds of different elements of what is peace through this lens. And then finally, we've got meaning, this sense of having meaning and purpose in our lives. This is about a celebration of life. It's about clarity, competence. It's about contribution, being creative, discovering things. It's about self-expression, having purpose, to matter, about hope, about learning. These things drive us. And when we perceive that these particular needs are not being met, we feel bad. But when we perceive that whatever it is that we're doing, the strategies that we've got for meeting these needs are successful, then we feel good. So this is how emotion works. Okay, so let's go back to what we were talking about previously. Here's our model essentially. These are the 7 emotional needs, and what we're interested in doing as part of this behaviour change model is mapping these 7 emotional needs to get that emotional insight into how people are feeling and how they're perceiving the world. Because if we look at this slide, what's really important to understand is that our emotions are responses. But what are they responding to? Well, they're responding to narrative. They're responding to thoughts, stories in our minds. If you've ever done cognitive behavioural therapy, one of the key things that teaches is this relationship between what you're thinking and what you're feeling, and becoming cognizant and mindful of these thoughts and stories that are playing out in your head, and the emotional responses that they then create. Now, where do they come from? Where do the narratives come from, the stories and the thoughts? Well, those come from our beliefs. And this is all to say that we do not live in a world where there's external stimuli and then there's some kind of response. It's mediated through our own beliefs. It's mediated through our interpretations of the world, the cognitive schema that we use to map and make sense of the world, and all our different experiences and learnings and traumas and so on. And they're all completely interconnected. And you'll see that every arrow has 2 ends because it's not a linear mechanistic process. We are entangled in webs of relationship. We share and co-create these lenses of belief. They're passed on from generation to generation, from group to group. They are culture. They are socially constructed and shared and maintained over time, as are our stories. And they literally colour and filter the world, because we're not just perceiving the outside world, we are first of all projecting onto it through these lenses of belief, seeing outside of us what is actually inside of us, because these maps, these schema, these ways of making sense of the world create a frame of reference. And if we confuse our beliefs about reality for reality, we get into a lot of trouble. So what we're trying to understand here is to map what is it that people are projecting, how are they perceiving, how is that mediated by their beliefs, and the stories and narratives that they're using to make sense of the world. So I've used a fair few words in there which we'll now unpick, but the point of this is to say that stimulus does not equal response. Our interpretation is a construction, and as individuals we are constructing these, but we're doing it socially too. But the point is that it's not uniform, it's not universal. You can have groups of people who are having shared beliefs and shared narratives, seeing the world, seeing the same stimuli in very, very different ways to other people. And depending on how they're then seeing it, it's causing different emotional reactions, which are then driving different behaviours. So you can have the same stimulus and a completely different response because you've got a different interpretation and a different emotional context underneath it all. Okay, so what do we mean by narratives? So narratives are structured accounts of connected events. This is the very human ability to take sequential events and to piece them together in such a way as to give them meaning and to help us make sense of the world. So over time, the narratives we're exposed to and the ones we tell ourselves contribute to the formation of our worldview and our identity. They shape our understanding of societal norms, cultural values, moral principles, and then our emotional responses to these narratives can reinforce or challenge these aspects of our identity. So they're absolutely essential to how we make sense of the world. We create our understanding of the world through story. It's how we're making sense of data, of cause and effect, of relationships. If you think about just the huge, infinite number of variables and the interconnectedness of all things, being able to pass all of that information and make sense of it requires story. That's how we're doing it. So it's really, really key that we understand how these different things are being pieced together. But we don't just stop there. The narratives themselves are also products of beliefs, and the relationship goes both ways. So what are beliefs? Okay, so narratives and beliefs, they're intricately connected, and narratives influence and shape our beliefs and vice versa. These narratives are providing a framework through which we understand and interpret the world, and then these interpretations solidify into beliefs. So it can be quite useful sometimes to think about time as a way of thinking about the difference between a belief and a narrative. It could quite often become the case that a narrative over time, through childhood, through just constant exposure to the same context, same relationships, a narrative then becomes a belief over time. It's more static. It is not static in that it's fixed, it's not fixed, they are fluid, but they just take an awful lot more energy to shift. And quite often it's the case that a competing narrative can help to dislodge an old belief. But there's this notion that our beliefs are these unquestioned assumptions that build up over time, these just complete almost automatic responses to making sense of the world, but we are looking at the world through them all the time. We just forget that they're there and that they can be different and that they can change. And the older we get, the more entrenched those neural pathways become, the harder it becomes to shift those beliefs. But it's still absolutely possible. And then we go one level up from beliefs and we're going to talk about paradigms. So what is a paradigm? In terms of this video, let's think about paradigms as this broader concept that refers to sets of beliefs and values. Let's think about them in terms of groups of beliefs. It might be that you change a belief, but it could be that that belief is existing in relationship to many other beliefs that you have about other topics, and they can all be grouped together. When Thomas Kuhn talked about paradigm change, it really is that top meta level of shifting the way that we categorize our beliefs. It's sort of like a meta belief level, and that when these things change, there's this cascade in the system around it where there's a new perspective that enables new beliefs and new narratives. Likewise, it's not a causal relationship in one direction. There's this relationship in the other direction too, as we've just discussed, this interplay between narrative, belief, and paradigm. Okay, so let's take this back one more step and let's look at this causal chain, as it were. So I like to think of them as nested holes, but this is just to bring things together in terms of getting us back to think about behaviour and behaviour change. So at the beginning we spoke about how behaviour is linked to emotion, and how ultimately it's a feeling, it's an emotional state that we're seeking through different activities and actions. And this is how they all link together. So our paradigms create a set out of which stem our beliefs. And again, this is just a model. All models are wrong, some are useful. Our beliefs then are giving us our frames of reference, they're filtering the world, they're our schema, and we are then interpreting the world through them, through this projection and perception process. Those interpretations of the world lend themselves to narratives as we make sense of the world. Those narratives then influence our thoughts and our feelings. Then how we're thinking and feeling about the world shapes our perceived options. And then in understanding those options and how we feel about them, the emotional responses that we're having to them, that then leads us into certain decisions. And those decisions lend themselves to actions, and then the actions create the results. So there's no point really in thinking about behaviour change just down here in terms of like, what information can I give people so that they make different decisions and take different actions? Because if you ignore all of this stuff above it, you might be able to influence something in the short term, but over the long term, people will just revert back to the old behaviour that they previously had. So what I'm encouraging us to do here is to think about how can we go upstream of just sort of behavioural economics kind of influencing immediate behaviours to drive one kind of action more than another. There's 100% a role for that. It's really powerful. It's really, really useful. But just in this model, what I'm trying to get us to do is to go upstream. How can we go higher up in order to exert or create conditions conducive to transformation, essentially longer term behavioural change, not just immediate in the moment as a response to a specific stimuli. There's a surface level utility to that, but what I'm interested in encouraging here is a deeper discussion of what makes us do what we do, and how does that relate to how we're understanding the world. Brings us back into this ontological perspective rather than just this immediate behavioural shift sort of way of looking at things. When we do this, we then can start thinking about how we communicate in a really empathetic way. Once we've understood and looked at a group of people that we want to engage with, a particular target audience that we're seeking to influence the behaviours of, be that through marketing, advertising, policy making, campaigning and so on, we need to map their emotional needs in relationship to the beliefs that they're holding and the stories that they're telling themselves that are leading them to undertake the behaviour that they are, or to not undertake a behaviour that would be more beneficial for them. There's a judgment call in that, but we'll come back to that in a moment. So if we can meet people at their specific unmet needs, and we can understand the negative beliefs and the negative stories that are causing them some kind of negative emotional response, and then we can address those beliefs, address those narratives, and use the language and connect with the emotional need that is really driving the behaviour, then we can help people to move from one unmet need state to a met need state. And that ultimately all behaviour is an attempt to meet an unmet emotional need. So if we could help people to move from a position where they're perceiving their needs to not be met to one in which those needs are perceived as met, and for that end state to be the behaviour that we're looking to encourage more of, then we can start to have more lasting long-term behaviour change. So we address, we allow, we challenge, and we empower and overcome negative beliefs and negative stories with tailored responses that are nuanced and textured by the lived experience of the people whom we're trying to influence. And that comes from empathy. And what this means is then that you're never actually making anybody do anything. It's about paying attention to what is already happening and then working out ways to best align and facilitate. How do you align with where people are at? How do you serve their needs? And how do you facilitate the shift in perspective such that they perceive their needs to be met and therefore escape suffering and move towards satisfaction in such a way that this new behaviour leads to that satisfaction? And it's not just about interventions at the decision-making level. It's got to go all the way back to actually connect with their beliefs and their stories, regardless of what you believe and the stories that you tell as an individual, because quite often the tendency here is to project and to think that everyone else is responding to stimuli and interpreting it in the same way that you are. So you need to put your own things on hold and just listen and observe and then find ways to connect with that. So, a couple of questions to put into this. If we're thinking about the existing beliefs and narratives of a group and how they shape perceptions of the emotional needs being met so that we can connect with those, then we need to study the beliefs, the narratives and the emotional needs of those groups, create narratives that connect and create conditions conducive to change. But what about if people have a set of beliefs that lead to the perception of their needs being met? Why would they change? It's a rhetorical question, but if somebody's in a situation where they're carrying out a particular behaviour that, say for example, it's an oil exec taking jet planes everywhere, if they've got a set of beliefs that lead to the perception of their needs being met, why would they change? So you have to start thinking about, well, they're not going to change just because you're shouting at them or you're calling them out for being wrong. There has to be more nuance to it. There has to be more empathy. And ultimately, if we can truly understand another person's beliefs and their stories and their emotional needs, we stand a much, much better chance of being able to engage with them and to develop a stronger relationship with them that then creates conditions conducive to alternative options arising. It also makes it more likely that we'd be able to challenge some of those existing beliefs and create enough emotional safety for people to explore other ways of looking at things rather than pushing them into a corner. So this is all really about alignment, facilitation and empathy. But it's provided for through a systematic approach to cognitive empathy, which is to understand narratives, beliefs, emotional needs. So another question for you. If your alternative narrative leads people to perceive that their needs are not being met, why would they change? So again, if we only go with an information-based approach to behaviour change, and we show people information that we think is really important and says, look, you really shouldn't do this. All of these different reasons here suggest that you should stop and do something different. Now, if we're not being cognizant of how that information that we are offering up is going to be received, how it's going to be filtered through specific lenses of belief and narratives that leads to a certain emotional need being perceived as being met or not, if we're ignoring all of that, then you can go out and put as much information out into the world as you like, and no one's going to do anything about it, because it might make a lot of sense to you. Like, you look at that information and go, well, it's obvious, isn't it? We should be doing this, that, and the other. But unless you're thinking about your audiences in specific segments that are based on shared beliefs, shared narratives, and shared understandings, you're not paying attention or appreciating how those different interpretations will lead to different emotional responses and different behaviours. So information is not enough. And be really mindful of the fact that if you are putting out information that leads people to perceive that as a result of your information that their needs will not be met, you cannot expect them to change their behaviours, which again is another argument to say we need to incorporate emotion as part of our models of behaviour change. So any behaviour change process that we're engaging in needs to do three big jobs as a result of this. Okay, so in order to create lasting behaviour change based on this model, there's three big things that this campaign and this approach needs to do. Number one, needs to hold up a mirror. So we need to encourage reflection by creating a disorienting dilemma that causes groups to question the validity of their existing beliefs. This is how we go upstream. And it has to be genuine. We can't just exert force or coerce or manipulate or try and persuade. We have to come from a genuine place and say, look, there's a real dilemma to look at here, in order to get people to question the validity of their existing beliefs. Otherwise, they'll just go and pick up another belief that enables them to perceive their needs as being met, and the truth will just, be lost. So it has to be genuine, it has to be compelling, it has to be honest, and it has to cut to the quick. Followed by consistent engagement with a new discourse, both individually, but more importantly with others. So we're holding up this mirror and we're doing it socially to say, look at the beliefs. Are they really working for you? Are they a true reflection of reality? What are the consequences of some of these beliefs? What's that causal chain, that downstream process from this belief? Or what is this belief blocking us off from? Or are we confusing our reality with this belief about reality, and showing that this belief about reality is insufficient or in some way based on false assumptions. And then finally, it has to be cemented. This new belief, this new discourse can't just be theoretical. It has to be cemented with action. There has to be some kind of commitment, however small, to act upon this new discourse, this new belief, this new way of seeing. Secondly, it has to be empowering. So the new narrative and the belief or the paradigm must be more compelling, of higher utility, and enable people to perceive their needs being better met by the new story than the old one, now that the original one has been dislodged by holding up that mirror. So again, it's not just information is not enough. It has to be empowering. It has to tell a story that enables people to better perceive their needs being met, because ultimately we have to keep coming back to this emotional aspect to behaviour. All of the processing, all of the information ends up with some kind of emotional outcome that's then stimulating behaviour. So let's be mindful of that and recognise that we have to tell convincing stories that lead to better ways of interpreting the world, that allows us to better perceive our needs as being met. And then we'll see more action as a result. And then the last big job that any behaviour change process has to incorporate is this notion of trust. We have to create emotional safety for change, addressing any fears, unconscious or otherwise, through social proof, as well as by using framing and language that is non-violent, non-judgmental and non-accusatory, which is to say compassionate, forgiving and accepting. Social proof is such a big piece of this, because this is all done socially. We are constructing our realities together. They're not fixed, and they're all influencing each other through the discourse of our particular culture, our particular place and society. Okay, in terms of giving an idea as to sequence and how you might want to go about incorporating this. So behind this is essentially an argument to say that we need to understand emotion, we need to incorporate that into our behaviour change models. We therefore need to think about mapping existing emotional needs, the perceptions of them being met or not, being able to name them. So this is about autonomy, this is about connection, this is about play and so on. We also need to undertake deep listening to find the narratives that people are using to make sense of the world. And we need to identify the beliefs that people are holding that lead to all of this. And this is what we do. This is qualitative research. This is our ontology for doing exactly that. Now, when you've got that information, you've understood those beliefs and those narratives and those emotional needs at play, how do you then take that and place it into some kind of campaign or strategy for change? Now, this comes from transformative learning theory, and it's based on this idea that there's this disorienting dilemma at the beginning. There's then this posing of questions that unearth current assumptions. So this is where this critical reflection begins, which then turns into critical self-reflection. We've caught someone's attention, and there's this event that has happened that's made people ask a really, really important question. And maybe there's a series of questions that start getting people thinking differently, challenging their existing beliefs. Then there's this process that people go through when their beliefs become challenged, where it's not fun. There's a certain amount of discontent to it, and the process of it is challenging. So we then need to start bringing in this social proof that says this is totally normal. This is a shared experience. Others have negotiated a similar shift, and you start hearing stories about other people who've gone through a similar process, and that's more encouraging. Again, that's creating conditions conducive to change by social reinforcement and social construction. Now that they've gone down that rabbit hole a little bit further, it's about exploring options for new roles and relationships and actions based on, well, who am I and what am I doing if my beliefs are different? We can think about society at large at the moment in response to the climate and ecological crises. Like, so much of what we do and have taken for granted for so long suddenly becomes in the spotlight, and you have to start thinking, well, if I need to do things that are radically different, what does that look like? Who am I? What job am I going to do? How am I going to show up in the world? What do I now believe to be true, and how can I live in alignment with that? It's a difficult process to navigate. There's then a critical assessment of assumptions, which then asks the question of, like, what is it that I've been taking for granted all of this time? And then how can I try on new roles? And it's this patient process of trying to do things differently now that we're starting to see things differently. Then there's this course of action that we're planning to better understand, okay, well, how does this look going forward? Supplemented with new knowledge, new skills for implementing that plan, building that competence and self-confidence in that role and that relationship, and then reintegrating all of this process back into your life and into your perspective. So this is a long-term process. It's not just a one and done kind of thing. There needs to be this support structure and this critical engagement, and supplemented by discourse over time. It's a big thing. And you can't make anybody transform. You cannot force this on anybody. Your way is not the only way. Everybody who's working in behaviour change is trying to assert that they've got it right and everyone else needs to follow suit. But we do not have free will in that sense. Like, you can only change yourself. You can only really exert any kind of agency in your own life and who you are and how you show up. But in so doing, you can create conditions conducive to other people following suit, should they choose to, should that be aligned with who they are and what they need and want. And the more empathetic that we can become in our communications and our understandings of others, then the easier it is to create those conditions that are conducive to more people doing the same, especially when they can see that this different way of seeing and being in the world leads to their emotional needs being better catered for. So there has to be some kind of positive outcome for it. When I think about the climate and ecological emergency, for example, although there is 100% a role for raising the alarm and trying to make people aware of what's going on, we really must start to see more opportunities for sharing a shared vision of a better future, as opposed to just calling out what's wrong about the present. The idea of just stopping everything and calling everything out and how it's insufficient is itself insufficient as a measure to tackle the problems that we see. And what's therefore needed more than ever is this positive story and sets of belief that allow us to look at the present, to look at all of it as it is, and to respond to it in ways that enable us to envision a better future. And this, for me, is the real skill of storytelling at this moment in time in history, is how do we look at something terrifying, respond without fear, and tell a story that is believable because it's attached to existing beliefs, and it's using language and storytelling that makes sense of those beliefs and ways of seeing the world, and that ultimately leads to the perception of emotional needs being of emotional needs being met. That is the key storytelling question of this period, as far as I'm concerned, to help us to understand, well, what do we do if we can't make anybody do anything? And if behaviour change really isn't something that's asserted or exerted on other people? Well, we have to listen. We have to pay attention to the fact that all of life and all of society is in process. There are these webs of relationship and entanglements, and everything's so deeply, wonderfully interconnected that it's already happening. It is playing out. It is in process. So how can we best align with what is there in society? When I think back to like brands, and I think to innovation and new product development and so on, rather than thinking about how can I create a product and then go out and find a market for it, it's got to be the other way around. It's this market product fit. We look at what's going on in society and in people. We find large groups of people who are experiencing a particular challenge or problem, and then we come up with ways of creating value for them by serving those needs and those problems. There's also a role at the moment to not only serve needs, but to help shape them in order to create markets, societies, citizenships essentially, and bioregions and countries and ecosystems that are within planetary boundaries, so that human activity then becomes within this regenerative threshold of the planet. So there's also a role here not to just respond to needs, but to help shape them too. And ultimately what's been argued here is to shape those needs in ways that enable people to perceive their needs being better met. And when I say needs, I mean emotional needs. So Carol Sanford came up with 4 paradigms how we can think about interacting with people and places in terms of facilitating change or interacting with groups. If we think about this in terms of, say, within a large corporation or within a group of people that we're trying to interact with, let's go with the business, and let's say it's a large one. One attempt of thinking about leadership and management and behaviour change within those contexts is value return. And it's like you look at this structure, this system, and you go, okay, how can I extract as much value from these people and this place? And you can think about this collectively in society at large as well. So you're trying to shift what's happening within the system by maximising the amount of value that you can extract from it. The second way of looking at things is to arrest disorder, to say, okay, well, if we can stop these things from happening, then more good things are going to happen and we can achieve the outcomes that we're going for. So let's focus on stopping these particular behaviours over here. Let's add resistance into the system so that this thing gets squashed, so that these things can broaden and get more of them, increase. That's the word I was looking for. And then the third way of looking at those same systems and structures is to say do good, which is to say I know what's going to work here really well, so let's impose this system on everybody. And if everybody does what they're supposed to do, then it's going to work for everybody and we're all going to be much, much better off for it. So it's this approach to transformation of doing good. Now, there is a role and a time and place for all of these things. But as we start to go through this, you're starting to see now we go from what can I take, what can I stop, to what can I make happen. It's all good stuff. But finally, the next step is regenerate life, which is to look at that same structure and that system and to listen to it, to observe it, and to ask, what does it need? How can I create conditions conducive to the evolution of the capacity of these people in this place to thrive and to do what is theirs to do? So it then becomes about giving. So we've gone from taking and keeping to giving and receiving. And this last step here is really about looking at what is alive in people and places, and then asking yourself, how can I encourage more of the thriving and the flourishing in line with the behaviours that I'm hoping to see more of in the world. So to come back finally, the argument here is to say that it's really important for us to understand how people are making sense of the world if we want to understand behaviour, and ultimately if we want to change behaviour. We can't exert or force behaviour change on anybody, but by listening, by observing, by studying and understanding people's emotional needs, how they're perceiving those needs to be met or not, through understanding the stories and the narratives that they're using to make sense of the world, by understanding the beliefs that they hold about the world and the frames of reference that they're using. We can then best understand what it looks like to see the world through their eyes. It's this idea of old school opticians that used to put the glasses on people and put the lenses in and say, is that better with or without? So that we can get the prescription of how they're seeing the world. We can do the same thing through qualitative research to a certain extent, and we can start thinking about audiences based on their prescriptions, their shared beliefs and the shared narratives that they've got that are then leading them to have certain emotional responses to external stimuli that are then driving their behaviours. I haven't spoken here about the links with physiology, but they very much are there. I'll do a video on that on another day. But it's also really important to remember this role of projection and perception. Ultimately, what this model is a framework for empathy. We call it the empathy framework as a result. And for me, empathy in its fullest is forgiveness. Using this model, we can understand individuals and groups by understanding how they are seeing the world and how they are constructing their reality. It's this understanding that we're all looking at the world in certain ways. We are filtering it through our traumas, through our wins, through our conditioning, through our programming, through our experiences, through our stories, through our exposure to certain kinds of media, our relationships with other people, our social context. And that is then leading us to perceive whether our needs are being met or not at an emotional level. And this is an attempt to give structure to that process, to draw in emotion into these models, and to understand people's subjective experiences of the world, in the hope that we can also find shared subjectivities. It lends itself to this idea that there isn't an objective reality when we start thinking about the human experience, in the same way that we could argue there is an objective understanding of space and time and material. When it comes to interpretations of the world and how we see it and how we act upon it, at best perhaps we can have shared subjectivities or intersubjectivities. And once we start to understand people in that way, it encourages us to communicate to different groups in different ways, because they are looking through different prescription glasses, and we need to accommodate how close, how far, and the size of the font of what it is that we're looking to share, so that that other person can see it. If we know that we're holding something up that somebody with a certain prescription just cannot read, we need to adjust so that they can. And that comes from understanding that person and where they are and where they're at. So that's the long and the short of it. That's the empathy framework. I hope it's been really useful for you. We found it to be incredibly useful for thinking about audiences in different ways, coming up with different strategies for communication as a result, understand different ways to develop strategy. This is the framework that we use to give insight into different audiences in a new way that incorporates emotion in a reliable and repeatable manner. If you think that this would be useful to you, if there's anything that I can do to help you with your behavior change strategies, with your advertising, your marketing, your engagement of people in terms of like perhaps stakeholders or the development of policy and the rollout of that in terms of trying to shift behaviours, then give me a call. There'll be a button somewhere around here where you can find me on LinkedIn, or you can go to the website and DM me or something like that. If you're still watching this and this has been useful to you and my cats haven't put you off yet, you can like and subscribe this video so that it gets in front of more people and the algorithm will then show it to more people. But aside from that, that's it from me. I'm Rob from Source 9 Insights. I hope this has been useful to you, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you very much.